my world changed 5 years ago at the age of 15 when I was diagnosed with autism. I was repulsed when my parents sat me down to tell me this, thinking they had imposed some disability onto me. I was angry, I was furious, and I was confused. So I did what any 15-year-old would do. I turned to Dr. Google. I began researching everything I could about autism, and what I found myself in possession of was this potent sense of perpetual clarity. Everything up until that point just made complete sense to me. You see, I came to understand why I'd always felt so different from other people, why I'd always crave structure and routine, why I'd always get so intensely fixated on certain interests, even to the point of becoming completely obsessed when others would eventually lose interest. Why I was able to hyper-focus on a singular task for hours on end without flinching when others would get easily distracted. Why I'd always struggle to decode sarcasm, to understand certain social cues, the absurd concept of people saying things they didn't mean and meaning things they didn't say. You see, to me, my autism diagnosis was an unmitigated relief. Now, I've always loved rules. I love adhering to rules, and yet I also love strategically finding technicalities and loopholes around rules. But most importantly, injustice makes me want to peel my face off. Can't stand it. And so I found myself studying law and biomedical science at university. And naturally, I became interested in our justice system as it pertains to autistic people. And when I graduated from university, I looked to establish my own law firm, defending people with disabilities and autism alike, and fighting for a justice system which caters for all, including autistic people. But what I have learned on this topic is absolutely staggering. You see, around 2% of people have autism, and yet studies show that approximately 4 to 5% of prisoners are autistic. And this doesn't even include the undoubtedly numerous undiagnosed autistic prisoners. So why is it then that the proportion of autistic people is 2 times greater inside our prisons compared to that of the general population? Well, as a law clerk at various criminal defence firms, law student and super obsessed autistic person, I researched like a dog to a bone. What I found were 3 autistic characteristics which were the underlying cause for crimes. It is these 3 autistic characteristics which render autistic people incredibly vulnerable in our justice system. So, number 1, an inability to read and respond to social cues. More often than not, autistic people caught up in our justice system are not criminally driven per se, but rather criminal behaviour among autistic people is often a result of social naivety and simple misunderstanding. Now, this can be anything from following instructions from the wrong person without realising it, to not understanding what a police officer is telling them to do or say, to committing an offence from genuinely misunderstanding social cues, to oversharing and being exceptionally trusting in police interviews, where misunderstanding leads to misinterpretation. Furthermore, autistic people can be unaware of the impact of their actions, therefore failing to outwardly express empathy and remorse, which can in turn land them with an even harsher sentence. So, to provide you with an example of this, there was an Australian case wherein an autistic man, let's call him John, had his sister's boyfriend invite him to a party. And John was excited, he was over the moon, he'd never been invited to a party before. At the party, John met a stranger who he thought was his friend within 20 minutes. And this newfound friend gave John a bag and told him to take it home with him. And so John, thinking he was doing a good deed to this newfound friend, took the bag, put it in the boot of his car, and at the end of the party, he took the bag home and put it under his bed. And being curious, John decided to open the bag to find that it contained guns in it. And John panicked, he was scared, he didn't know what to do, and so he put the bag of guns back under his bed. And eventually, the cleaners found this bag of guns, and John was imprisoned. Number 2, hypersensitivities. This often entails losing control and experiencing a sensory overload which wouldn't typically affect a person without autism. Autistic people can have too high or too low a pain threshold, can be hypersensitive or hyposensitive to touch, sound, smells and the like. Furthermore, autistic people tend to have a very strong craving and propensity for consistency, predictability, as well as structure and routine in their environment. And any unpredictability or disruption in this regard can be very distressing for an autistic person, can lead to frustration and rage, which can in turn render them more susceptible to committing crimes such as trespass to person and trespass to property. For example, there was another Australian case wherein an autistic man, let's call him Tim, went to catch a bus, but Tim forgot his concession card. And when the bus inspector was questioning Tim as to why he'd forgotten his concession card, all of a sudden, Tim assaulted the bus inspector because the bus inspector brushed past Tim's arm. And Tim was also imprisoned. Number 3, obsessive interests. Autistic people tend to have a very specific interest which the autistic person obsesses over and knows everything about. However, when the said obsession pertains to something of a criminal nature, such as guns, drugs, theft or stalking, or when the said obsession simply renders the autistic person more susceptible to committing crimes, then the autistic person can inadvertently find themselves caught up in our justice system. For example, there was a case from the US wherein an autistic man, Darius, obsessed with the public transport system, was taught to drive and operate trains and buses as a child by employees of a train station. And as an adult, Darius decided to get in a train and operate it, getting his passengers from A to B, all in perfect timing, all passengers being satisfied with the service. However, ultimately, Darius wasn't employed to operate this train. And so he was charged with impersonating a federal employee, and he was imprisoned. And upon his release, imprisonment hadn't changed Darius as a person. Darius was still obsessed with trains. And so he again began driving and operating trains and buses. He was again imprisoned, again released, and the cycle just continued. And Darius has now spent most of his adult life incarcerated and segregated from society. And so in light of this, it behooves us to consider whether in such cases we are merely punishing autistic people simply for being autistic. And now, as controversial as that might sound, let me tell you why. If John is unable to decipher who he should and should not take instructions from, and to know what to do in extreme circumstances, such as finding guns in a bag he's already in possession of. If Tim cannot help but lose control due to his hypersensitivity to touch. If Darius, so obsessed with the public transport system, even to the point of driving and operating trains and buses without being employed to do so, well then firstly, can't we just employ people like Darius? But overall, are we not just punishing autistic people simply for being autistic? If so, there should be an uproar. Is it really fair to imprison autistic people the same way as anyone else? Well, I firmly believe it is not. That in most cases, suitable therapy is more appropriate. But unfortunately, the challenges do not end here. You see, I began searching for criminal defence lawyers specialising in autistic clients here in Perth. And I could not find one. So I broadened my search statewide, the entirety of Western Australia, and still not one. And it was only when I broadened my search Australia-wide, the entire nation, did I find one South Australian lawyer. And sure, I found the occasional lawyer here and there in the US and the UK, but what was interesting to me was that each of these rare lawyers whom I came into contact with were all under the assumption that they were the only lawyer of their kind in their respective nation. And none of them were autistic themselves. Needless to say, there is an abject lack of lawyers who understand and can defend autistic people in our justice system. Unfortunately, the media coverage of criminal offences involving autistic people is very often misleading and unduly sensational. Furthermore, there is a shortage of expert witnesses who can provide court reports and testimonies for autistic people caught up in our justice system. And really this illuminates the systemic lack of understanding in our justice system of the condition, let alone how it presents in offenders. Now, you may have noticed that I struggle with eye contact and body language, and I am very formal, and it's not just mere nerves. You see, as an autistic person, these somewhat basic things don't come naturally to me as they may to many of you all. But consider an autistic person maybe less able to speak than myself in a witness box giving evidence. There is a lack of eye contact, unusual facial expressions, a different body language, monotone of voice, and a jury of our peers, who, despite not being allowed to construe such observations as guilt, will do so unconsciously anyway, because they're human beings. And so the question, and perhaps what you're no doubt wondering, is, well, what can be done? Well, firstly, we can fund much needed research into the experiences of autistic people in our justice system. We can conduct surveys with a sufficient number of respondents, because studies differ greatly between legal jurisdictions. We can undertake qualitative research, interviewing and listening to the stories of autistic people who have already been through the justice system, learning from their experiences and using this to dictate future policy, procedure, and training. Secondly, we require a more far-reaching screening process of an autism diagnosis for people prior to entering imprisonment, which is vital for the support of that person due to their inherent vulnerability, gullibility, and trauma. And thirdly, I believe that in most cases, punishing an autistic person by sentencing them to imprisonment is unnecessary and thus unconscionable. In most cases, I believe that suitable therapy is more appropriate. Studies show that autistic people do not respond effectively, nor even adequately, to mainstream correctional settings. Autistic people do not fare well in prison. And finally, there is a critical need for greater understanding of autism in the community, particularly among lawyers, police officers, judges and jurors, albeit you do not have to work in the legal sector, nor even be a jury member to make a difference. You see, the judiciary system, to judge, transcends the courtroom. Teachers can employ greater understanding, awareness and empathy when interacting with or delivering punishment upon an autistic child behaving badly in classrooms. Public servants can demonstrate greater empathy and awareness when interacting with autistic people in the public. Doctors and nurses can demonstrate greater empathy. 100 years ago, due to the sense of shame and stigma felt by families, autistic people were just sent to psychiatric units. No questions asked, for their own good, and in doing so, isolated from society at large. And so clearly we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, because being autistic is not a crime. Thank you.